I get shot at. A lot. But it isn't what scares me about this job. When I arrive at a home and see someone burst out of the front door clutching a rifle, I know what to expect. They have something to lose. They're scared and they don't know what to do. So I tell them. I give them resources on fighting back. I refer them to law firms who do pro bono work. Government bodies and charities that can help them get back on their feet. I speak calmly and with empathy. And people listen. Some even thank me as they pack their things up and drive away. The suicides are harder to deal with. I get at least 3 or 4 a year. And people who kill themselves out of spite really go all out on the spectacle. The harder it is for the bank to clean up, the better. And people assume the bank puts their house on the market the second it's seized, but a house can sit forgotten for years before I'm sent to look it over. Lone bodies swinging in empty living rooms, flesh like melted candle wax from all that time left in open air. I find it profoundly sad. These people lay themselves out like a spiteful diorama and then no one turns up. They slit their throats while clutching eviction notices, and by the time I arrive the blood has dried and the ink has faded. The worst ones don't just hurt themselves, but their loved ones too. Suicide pacts are more common with the elderly, but it isn't always octogenarians. Families too. It's rare, but it does happen. A sun-baked house with drawn curtains, so much time passed in the dry autumn heat that their skin turned paper-thin. Receding lips. Black toothless gums born in a rictus grin. Hell of a thing to see staring out of a crib. Each house is its own apocalypse, its own ruined city for me to wander. Whiskey in the toilet cistern. Fentanyl under the bed. Bills past due. And it doesn't just end with the people we kick out. These places are empty so long you'll often get squatters. Usually harmless. Not always. Some have the potential to be thoroughly lethal. Stringy men and women with flinty eyes and missing teeth who come bursting out of moldy old blankets and indoor tents, slashing box cutters wildly at the air. You could play tic-tac-toe on my forearms from all the defensive wounds. Even when they've moved on, the things they leave behind aren't exactly safe. Fumes from homemade labs can rot your lungs, and HIV-positive needles stuffed down the sides of old sofa cushions wait to prick curious fingers. And the cooks get real paranoid about being robbed, so they like to rig their homes with traps. They get inventive with whatever's lying around. Shards of glass on spring-loaded broom handles. Trick floorboards over boxes of razor blades. Shit-smeared knives hidden beneath false window sills. Every now and again I find a trap that's been set off. A baseball bat rigged to lash out at anyone entering the kitchen, blood and hair dripping from the bent nails hammered into the wood. No sign of the poor fucker who set it off, just a grisly trail of gore leading out of the house and into the nearby woods. Most likely candidate is the guy who set the trap. These addicts stay up for days and pass out, then when they wake up the first thing they do is head for their stash, not remembering what they left behind. One time I found the guy lying a few feet away from his own trap. He kept his money in this old metal lunch box at the back of a cupboard, and he'd rigged it so anyone reaching in would get a hell of a surprise. The blade went in at his elbow and left just below the knuckle on his thumb. No helping him after that. He died bleeding out on his late grandmother's cold linoleum. What a god-awful way to go. And his little lunchbox? On the ground and empty of everything worth taking. Police reckon someone was with him when it happened. Must have gotten scared, so they took the cash and left him to die. It'd take a full month before I found him, and no one even reported him missing in the interim. You'd think the kid would be angry, but he wasn't. He just looked like he was scared. 19, going through withdrawal and dying slowly. Curled up like a baby, one hand gripping his opened wrist. You can't trap the ocean in your fist. It leaks through your fingers. That kid knew what was coming. I could see it in his eyes. Terrified. Fucking terrified. Meth is a hell of a drug. These poor guys fry their brains out in the middle of nowhere. I can't even begin to imagine what they think they see out there. What visits them in the dark? Found this trailer once that had been rigged with damn near 100 traps. They weren't particularly sophisticated, but they were numerous and vicious and desperate, and they circled the lone motorhome out in the middle of the desert like an invading army made of knives and bear traps and stolen guns and even a few hastily made IEDs. Took me and a bomb squad a week just to get to the front door, and by the time we opened it we were all fairly certain of one simple fact: this place hadn't been rigged to keep thieves out. Whoever had set the traps had been scared of something leaving. Probably just drug-fueled paranoia on behalf of whoever set them, but I think the idea that something was in there waiting for us got under our skin anyway. During the operation we'd sometimes get shouted reports of someone moving around in the trailer and the whole site would go to hell. Armed men and women lying on their bellies. Iron sights lined up on the front door, hands shaking. I guess we kept asking ourselves over and over what's in there that had someone so scared they set all these traps. When we finally got our answer, the first thing we found was a meth lab, pretty par for the course. Less normal was a body that had been torn to fucking pieces. Halfway to dust after all that time in the heat had passed, but it was strewn all over the interior. Walls. Floors. Ceiling. Couldn't argue it was a natural death or a product of scavengers, not unless coyotes can work a lock and key. What was left of his head and torso looked like he'd gone through hell. I'm hardly a forensic expert, but it looked to me like he'd died slowly and painfully. Missing fingers. Teeth. One eye plucked out. Torture is what it made me think of. Even stranger than all that though was what we found sat on the kitchen counter next to all those broken beakers and stained chemistry equipment. A doll. Not like a kid's doll. Porcelain, like a collector's item that had seen better days. Scared the shit out of me, given the circumstances and all. Couldn't shake the feeling whoever had made all those traps had done so with that thing in mind. Which begged the question, who was the poor guy stuck inside the trailer? And what had happened to him? Cops wrote it off. Meth is a hell of a drug, so they say. We all knew that. Only I wasn't so sure. I've seen a lot of weird shit. Who knows what visited that poor guy out in the wild, so far from civilization. A lot of life gets lived out in the world, out on the plains or in forests and amongst hills, far from prying eyes. You get a sense of it in my job, the sheer quantity of untold stories. Failed dreams, great triumphs. Abandoned canvases. Well-worn guitars. Heydays that came and went, or simply never came at all. Most stories follow a rhythm. Most. Some, like that doll, raise profound questions. Others aren't really stories at all, so much as nightmares just waiting for the next victim. This world is full of hidden needles waiting for probing hands. There are rare occasions where I'll advise the bank to not sell a property. They become part of a kinda no-go zone the government has set up around the country. I only see bits of this machinery at work. Whatever bureaucracy manages it is way over my pay grade. But there is a system in place for managing the worst of the worst. I'm not talking ghosts either. None of the examples I've given so far would be candidates. Sounds fucked up, I know. Scrub the blood. Scrape the brains. Pick the shotgun pellets out of the plaster. If the next family who move in have to contend with the ghosts of a few clumsy meth heads or disgruntled former owners, well, so be it. No, for a place to be deemed a no-go it has to be beyond recovery and an active threat to life. I'm talking factories with bottomless holes that pump out enough radiation the government has to build a nuclear dump site just to make a convincing cover. Although that is a bit of an extreme example. Most of the time we just blame it on radon or meth fumes and condemn it. Had this one place. A farmhouse where a family of 5 had lived for nearly 60 years. By the time I got there the kids were adults and the parents had been dead for a while. The children had resisted selling the family home, tried to keep up with the payments. But they had their own debts and in the end the bank got its pound of flesh. At a glance the house didn't look too bad. Bit run down, sure. But my standards are low. Crack den low. Windows were intact. No graffiti. Roof hadn't been stripped. Satellite dish was still up. From where I sat in my car, gulping down a lukewarm bottle of water that had spent the drive tumbling around the passenger footwell, the house was relatively untouched by anything except nature and time. Something about that gave me pause. Shame I didn't listen to the gut feeling telling me it was all sorts of weird that an isolated house had gone unmolested for so long. I grabbed the keys the sheriff had given me and went inside hoping for an easy gig. 3 hours later and I was crawling out a kitchen window I'd smashed, the shirt and skin on my back cut to ribbons. I stumbled to my car, chest near bursting from the pounding of my heart, and my eyes fixed on the empty window frame I'd just escaped. A lone figure, barely visible with the bright sun in my eyes, but still too substantial to be a mere ghost. My wounds were a testament to that. Once the doctor had finished patching me up, I sat in the waiting room and tried calling the former owners, the siblings. One after the other. I wanted to know what had attacked me, if anyone knew what I was walking into. There'd be hell to pay if so. The oldest son was the first to answer. I didn't go all in straight away. I asked probing questions, took my time before I mentioned the basement. The guy laughed when I brought it up. Told me he hated going down there as a kid because he'd hear the weirdest noises, like someone moaning. They all thought a ghost lived down there in the dark, and to keep them from hurting themselves or playing around with stuff they shouldn't, their father had embellished this ghost. Given it a name. Marion, he called her. Marion lived in the basement, hiding amongst the crates of old photos and clothes. She lurked behind the half-disassembled lawnmower, scuttling always to the dark places at the very edge of your eyesight. Marion had long fingernails and a haggard flour sack dress. She had black lips and a pointed nose and a wart the size of your thumb. Marion 8 children, their dad had told them with glee. And if Marion knew there were 3 bite-sized kids living just above her, she'd come out of the basement and come crawling up the stairs with arms as long as her body, and she'd slink her way into their bedrooms using the shadows as cover, and she'd start by taking tiny little bites out of any bare feet that lay dangling in the cold. What about that freezer? Did you ever use it? I asked. Oh God, no, he said. Even now that basement gives me the creeps, and that freezer was where Marion lived, or so we figured as kids, so we stayed the hell away from it. It was just always there in the back, looking old and forgotten. I think Dad used to go hunting when we were little and that's where he'd keep the meat, but he phased all that out before I'd turned 5. He seemed sincere, so I didn't tell him what I'd found in the house at the end of my inspection. He didn't know that behind that freezer was a false wall, and behind that wall, basement number 2. Homemade. God knows how the father managed it with no one noticing, but he dug it out and made a private, soundproofed space. Hollowed out a room about the size of your typical jail cell. The furniture was threadbare, deliberately so. A single mattress propped up against one wall. An iron shackle bolted into the foundation. A dentist's chair modified with restraints. And a stain. A vague Rorschach blob of ancient browns and almost greens that pooled outwards from a patch in the corner. It had texture. I knew that stain. I'd seen it before. Residue left behind after the professionals have finished peeling a desiccated corpse off a hard surface. At first I assumed someone had moved the source of that stain. There were even footprints. But they didn't look right. Something about them made me queasy. They had not been left in the residue. They were made of it. Something or someone covered in that stuff had been stomping around down there. Until that moment the inspection had been mundane and boring, but it isn't every day you stumble across a hidden dungeon. Now I was suddenly presented with a hell of a family secret, and one that didn't quite make sense. I stood there for a good minute trying to make the pieces of that puzzle fit. Had someone moved a corpse and gotten covered in rotten flesh, then walked around leaving a trail? Why the fuck had they done it barefoot? And why not clean it up afterwards? And how had they been so clumsy, yet so clean as well? There were no drag marks. I took another look at those prints and something inside my gut soured. Small feet. A woman's. We all know this story. Don't make me go over it. Basement out in the middle of nowhere. Restraints. A family man that no one suspects. He'd hunted all right. Sick fuck. So who had died in that basement? And who had left those prints? Not all of them were on the floor, either. With an increasingly shaky hand I tracked a few to the wall where they mounted the vertical surface and continued upwards and onto the ceiling. Just like that a cold sweat gathered on the back of my neck, and a powerful sense of the uncanny ran over me like ice water. Somewhere overhead the wind blew and the boughs of trees groaned in the yard. Sounds of another world. I could see it in my mind, up there, not far away. My car sitting in the shade. Those images felt like they belonged to another world. I desperately wanted to rejoin it, to leave this squalid little hole behind. All I had to do was walk out of that basement and make for my car. Only I wasn't so sure I wanted to move at all. Felt like I might break something brittle, the notion that the creeping dread I felt was all in my head. A product of an overactive imagination, nothing more. And yet I got this feeling that if I tried to run the nightmare would spill out into the real world and give chase. I even tried telling myself I didn't know what happened in that room. Not for sure. It could have been a game, one played between him and the wife. But then I looked at the chair again, at the cracked and frayed leather of ancient straps. There were teeth marks on some of them. I took a deep breath and regained control of my legs. Unless I saw something alive down there, I had to assume I really was alone down there, so I turned and began to walk. Eyes forward. Mind steeled against the myriad of little groans and creaks that felt as if they followed me, going from shadow to shadow. I couldn't stop myself from filling in the blanks of that basement's history, even as I told myself to stop. Maybe she died first. Maybe he did. Maybe he got bored and left her to starve, or maybe he nearly got caught and decided to put it all to an end. Maybe she snuck something sharp and killed herself. But she died for sure and she stayed dead a long time. at least a couple months for that kind of liquefaction. She lost cohesion. Skin. Muscle. Blood like the plug of mold that forms on top of forgotten coffee. I could see it in my head, her collapse. A claymation time-lapse. A riot of colors. Only somehow the natural cycle broke. She didn't go away completely, and no one came to take her away. Those were her prints on the floor and walls and ceiling, weren't they? She laid down. She died. And then, somehow, she got back up. By the time I reached the top of the basement steps, I'd scared myself so bad that sweat was pouring off me. So far the only things I'd seen on my way were just old boxes and crates and ancient bits of crap, weed whackers and leaf blowers with cobwebs and defunct logos fading away. But that didn't mean I was alone. There was something wrong with that place. I could feel it. A radiant heat, a palpable aura of hatred, even in the absence of anything seemingly real. It was so bad that as I opened the door I actually felt a moment of childlike relief, a little like how you might feel racing back to bed after going to the toilet in the middle of the night, convinced some ghost was just inches behind you. I laughed. And something cold and hard wrapped around my ankle. A hand had reached up between the slats of the stairs, like it was reaching straight out of the world of make-believe and into this one where things are real. I stared down, heartbeat like thunder in my ears, and slowly began to process what I was seeing in bits and pieces. First was the hand. Gnarled. Black. Like a badly sketched shadow visible only because it caught the light coming through the open door. And then beneath it, in the shadow, a face like a skull wrapped in a garbage bag, the plastic pulled tight so you could see the suffocating outline of empty eyes and a gaping mouth. I'd expected something wetter, something straight out of a bad horror movie. In reality, whatever was in that basement had undergone a strange transformation. I only ever saw it in parts, so I can't say for sure what all of it was like. But it sure as shit didn't look like a ghost or a corpse or anything else I'd ever seen or thought I'd seen in life or movies. Looked like a monster, the real deal, and I reacted like a child seeing the bogeyman. I made some weird half-muffled groan of fear and ripped my leg away so quickly that I surprised myself and got free. But whatever was hiding under those stairs was quick. Before I had time to take another step, it had left its hiding place, climbed the stairs, and was already driving me to the ground. The last thing I saw before my chin smashed into the kitchen floor was that Marion really did wear a flour sack dress. At the time this strange detail passed over me without notice. But in hindsight, the fact that the son would later recount that particular item of clothing convinced me his father had been the man responsible for that hidden basement. It wasn't like it had been waiting undiscovered when the family moved in. And on top of that, the father must have been a real piece of shit to inject that sort of sickening detail into a story he told his kids. He'd likely done it so if his prisoner ever escaped and his kids saw her, their first instinct would be to scream for their lives and run. I didn't know any of this at the time, of course. I had only vague notions of what had attacked me. Something hateful, for sure. Something that had died in that awful room and come back to life. God, she was so fucking angry. She pinned me, knelt on my back, and howled like a banshee that had been hit by a car. I pissed myself at the sound, at the feeling of helplessness. At the realization this was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. She went to work on my back with fingers I couldn't see, but could feel as white-hot tattoo needle pain. It lasted only a few seconds. The agony was enough to send me into spasms that knocked her off and onto the floor. That tiny moment of freedom was all I needed. I crawled to my feet and jumped headfirst out of the nearest window. I didn't give a fuck about any cuts I might acquire. If you could have felt what I felt, you wouldn't have either. These weren't scratches. Doctors compared my wounds to those left by a box jellyfish, the kind of thing that causes the muscle beneath to wilt and wither after a million hypodermic needles have turned the flesh to a porous sponge. I had to get skin grafts. I had to get rid of my car because they couldn't scrub what I'd left of my skin from the leather seats. Even now my back looks like I got run over by a mower. Still hurts when I put my top on each morning. Somehow they're not even the worst of my wounds. Just the biggest. The most visible. At least those scars made it easy to convince the bank not to sell. Normally it takes a lot of effort, but they took one look at the doctor's reports and agreed to condemn it thoroughly, pass the land on to whatever strange governmental department handles this kind of thing. That particular house has been left to crumble. No piece of paper or deed or mortgage payment is taking it back from Marion. We can only shut it off. The land is fenced, and every window has been slapped with so many toxic gas signs that I can only hope no one else is stupid enough to ever go back inside. Looking back, I really should have listened to my instincts. Squatters don't leave a place alone without good reason. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us including me and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for Dash. "It's alright, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right?" "I mean there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. One for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again I scanned the faces staring back at me. All barely illuminated by the light from the fire. All familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I mean. I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. "Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it," Dave said. "But it's so dark out in the forest now, we'd probably get lost if we leave now," someone else said. "Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow," Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. "Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe," Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought 1-person tents with us, but we could squeeze 2 if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally, like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. "Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here?" Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. "There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and..." I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the four outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it. His head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm gonna check why the person in my back seat has been so silent the whole time. Hey there strangers, my name is Ali May. I'm the owner of a small diner tucked away in a town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. The diner doesn't really get much action aside from townsfolk and the occasional out-of-towner passing through and looking for a hot meal. And when those folk happen to come by, I like to introduce myself, bring them their food, and then sit down with them and explain a little game I like to play to pass the time out here. For some context, I inherited this diner from my parents, and have spent practically my whole life in this town aside from the rare trips to nearby events, markets, state fairs, etc., but those are really only reserved for special occasions. And I don't mind that. I enjoy the peace and quiet that comes with my lifestyle, and I can't deny that as far as lives go, I happen to have myself a pretty good one. I have wonderful friends, the sweetest husband, and a beautiful baby girl named Kate. But as nice as my life is to me, I can't deny that it's also real slow. Not many big things have happened to me, if y'all understand what I'm saying. And so whenever an unknown face walks into my diner, I ask them if they have any stories to tell me. And if they do, I'm always more than happy to give them a discount on their meal. I've been doing this since I was 22, so about 10 years now. Okay, I'm going to admit something a bit embarrassing to y'all. The reason I had when I first started to do this was that I had recently found out about the notion of cryptids, and I thought the concept was pretty damn cool. More specifically, I thought people viewing me as a cryptid would be pretty damn cool. You know, some girl in some diner in the middle of nowhere that you end up spilling your darkest secrets to and then never see again. Wouldn't that be a kind of neat way to be perceived? Well, my spooky little young adult self thought so, and that's where it all began. Normally people are quite hesitant to talk at first. However, they tend to warm up to the idea after I remind them not only will we likely never cross paths again, but I don't care about what kind of story they tell me. Whatever they feel like talking about, I'll listen to. I just want a break from the monotony of small town life. And boy, have I heard it all. Love affairs. Childhood traumas. Bats hit deathbed confessions heard by nurses. The story of a very intoxicating and very hush-hush 2-month relationship a customer had with another woman in college before she tragically passed in an accident that she's never told a soul about since. Especially not her very Catholic now husband. But besides all that jazz, there's one type of story I keep being told. Horror. Now I get why this is. Ghost stories, supernatural shit, whatever you want to call it. That's the kind of thing people are hesitant to talk about. And in my opinion, half of it is because that's the kind of thing people are hesitant to believe. But who cares if you tell it to me? You're not going to see me again, so what's the harm in finally telling someone? It even wouldn't matter if I didn't believe them, they'd still get the discount. But I do believe the stories people tell me. It's something in their eyes, I think. When I look into them, I can see they're being haunted by something awful, and I think it helps them to talk about it. To leave here with the knowledge they're not carrying that burden alone. And carrying it with them is something I'm thankful I get to do. I listen to their stories, bring them sweet tea and dessert to cheer them up afterwards. I'll hold their hands if they'll let me, just generally try to help them. It's one small way I can make an impact on some people who are really hurting, being the kind stranger they can confide in knowing that they'll be believed. But anyways, I've told my husband some of these stories over the years, and he recently started browsing this subreddit and mentioned to me that I should think about sharing some of them with y'all. And so here I am, sitting in my comfy chair after my baby girl finally fell asleep with my laptop and my absolutely darling cat Cinnamon. I really do hope you guys enjoy the story I decided to share today, and I'll probably post some more soon. Smiley face. It was about 5 years ago now. I think this happened sometime in early July, so it was just after my 27th birthday. A young woman stumbled into the diner. I'd guess she was maybe a few years younger than I was. 23 maybe. Well, the poor thing looked like she hadn't properly slept in weeks, with eye bags so dark I had to take a moment to figure out if they were actually black eyes. She sat down at a booth and I came over to pour her some coffee, which she gratefully accepted. I took her order, waffles with powdered sugar and a side of mixed fruit, and moved to sit down across from her. Instead of asking if she had stories to tell, I decided to ask her if she was all right, as the way her eyes shifted around the room and the way her hands trembled so violently as she tried to use the cutlery made me nervous that she was in some sort of danger. She looked at me and her eyes began to water, and in the softest voice you could ever imagine she just told me that I wouldn't believe her. It was here where I explained some of the parts of my game, focusing on the fact that there's really no harm from talking about it if she wanted to. Our paths would probably never cross again. I remember the way she looked down at the table, as her hands moved to scratch quite violently at the skin on her arms, which were just covered in long red marks already. My heart absolutely ached at the sight, but I decided not to say anything for the time being, though it took everything in me not to reach over and take her hands away and hold them myself. Finally she sighed and met my gaze as she nodded ever so slightly at me. She told me she had a stalker, and not one she thought was human. The first time she saw him was a few months prior, when she was walking to her dorm alone one night back when she lived right by the Appalachian Mountains. She had gone out with some friends and didn't realize how late it had gotten, and by the time she had started to make her way home it was nearly 2 in the morning. The fastest way to get home meant she had to use a small path that cut through the woods, and she told me she was too worried about the big test she had to get home to study for to really think about the dangers of walking through there at night. As she walked she said she got that awful feeling that she was being watched, and out of nowhere she was hit with this horrific wave of anxiety, that her heart began to race like a scampering jackrabbit and she broke into a cold sweat. And then she noticed it watching her through the tree-line. It was tall and vaguely man-shaped, although she said she would hesitate to call it that. And by tall she meant inhumanly tall, roughly 7 or so feet by her guess. Its skin was a sickly pale and its eyes were bloodshot, accompanied by an impossibly wide grin that revealed way too many horribly stained teeth. From what she could see the thing was completely hairless, and was dressed in camouflage-type clothing, the kind that hunters and the military wear. She said that she froze up when she saw it, staring at the thing in absolute horror. And it just stayed there, smiling at her. Eventually she snapped out of it and bolted, yet the thing made no move to follow her. All it did was turn to face her and continued to smile as she ran off. She told me that when she got back to her dorm just got this sudden urge that she was going to be sick. And this was super weird, since the girl had only thrown up twice in her life, once when she got a really bad case of the flu when she was 10 and once when she got a little too drunk at a party in high school. Yet she had spent the next 10 minutes throwing up everything in her stomach and the next 20 dry heaving over the toilet. Her roommate had rushed in to find her covered in sweat and violently sobbing as she puked her guts out for no apparent reason. She had tried to tell her about the thing that she saw in the woods, but her roommate had told her that she was probably just sick with something and her mind was playing tricks on her. She said that night she had supposedly had these beyond horrible nightmares and her roommate told her the next morning she had woken up screaming 4 separate times. That was her first encounter with the thing, but it certainly wasn't the last. At this point she had begun hyperventilating, tears ran down her cheeks and a strangled cry wrenched itself from her throat. I quickly ran over to the counter to get her some napkins and a glass of water, before I finally gave in and grasped her shaking hands and held them tightly. I had asked her if she wanted to stop but she just shook her head, and so I held her hands and waited for her to continue with her story. She said she realized pretty quickly that whatever it was came with the night. At first she genuinely had just believed she had come down with some kind of awful virus, but when she woke up the next morning shaken and exhausted but by all other means healthy, she was very confused but didn't really know what else to do then email her professor to explain her situation and sit on her couch and watch episodes of her favorite show while she apparently clung on to her roommate for dear life. That was until nightfall came around and she saw the thing again, and this time it was watching her from her living room window. Instead of freezing up again she just started to scream, and when her roommate rushed over to see what was wrong she looked out the window and went pale as a ghost. She asked her roommate if she was seeing it too, and she just nodded before dragging her out of sight from the thing's view and calling the cops. Her symptoms immediately came back: the vomiting, the panic attack-like behavior, the sweating, all of it just like the night before. For some reason though, her roommate was completely unaffected. Shaken sure, but no sickness, no nightmares, nothing. Just like the few other people after that who saw it when they were with her. Although nobody ever saw it without her. And then the police showed up and things got even worse. They couldn't brush her concerns off, even in the state she was in. Her perfectly healthy roommate had seen it too, and so they began to look into things. And what they found was absolutely nothing. The thing couldn't be seen on the security camera footage right beside where it had been standing. They couldn't find a record of any person matching its description in their databases. No matter how many times she called over the next 3 months, no matter the situation, no matter if there was another person there who insisted they saw it too, they couldn't find any evidence of it being there or any record of its existence. She went to a psychiatrist who determined she didn't seem to be suffering from any sort of psychotic disorder, and other doctors at the local hospital ran every test they possibly could to explain her symptoms, had CT scans, MRIs, they all came back totally clean. She had no head trauma, tumors, any type of head injury that could be causing hallucinations. Her blood tests showed there was no autoimmune disease that could explain the symptoms. She did gastric emptying scans and other similar tests which eventually confirmed there was no disorder that could explain the vomiting. The symptoms never happened during the day, during testing, or in any other situation. She never got sick, had any other type of nightmare or hallucination, she just kept seeing whatever the hell that thing was and getting violently ill. Eventually she decided to just try her best to stay inside after dark, which worked for a while until the night where everything went very wrong. She had gone to a local cafe to get some homework done and accidentally fell asleep at her computer, and had woken up to one of the waitresses gently shaking her awake and telling her it was closing time. Their closing time was 10 p.m. The sun had set over an hour ago. Her hands started to shake more violently than they already were, which I didn't even think was possible, and she choked back another sob before she continued to speak. She dug through her backpack to find her pocket knife and tucked it into her jacket sleeve before she began to brave her way through the darkness back to her house. The cafe was only a 10-minute walk with the shortcut, 20 if she stayed on the streets. She considered her options for a moment, trying to figure out which was more dangerous. She eventually decided that while the streets would take longer, they were better lit and maybe still had some people out. It wasn't that late, but this wasn't exactly a college town either. There wasn't exactly a nightlife besides a 1 or 2 bars. Odds were that she could make the whole trip and run into less than a dozen people. She had made it 10 minutes before she got the feeling she got on the path again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched coupled with cold sweats and horrible anxiety. She slipped her knife out of her jacket into her hand and held it out in front of her as her gaze shifted to the nearby alleyway. And there it was, tall and pale as death, with the same bloodshot eyes and smile with too many teeth, and that same damn camouflage outfit it always seemed to wear. Only this time it also held something else. A bouquet of wilted flowers. As the thing held them out to her, she turned and bolted down the street, all thought of defending herself from that thing long forgotten. This time though it dropped the flowers and took off after her, and this was the first time she realized just how fast it actually was. She told me she had always been a good runner. She did track in high school and even made the state finals, and this was without a doubt the fastest she had ever run in her life, but this thing somehow caught up to her in a matter of seconds. And then it reached out and grabbed her shoulder. At this she took her hands away from mine and pulled down one of the sleeves of her yellow woolen cardigan, revealing her bare shoulder, and my breath caught in my throat. On her shoulder was a large scar resembling the shape of a hand. Palm on the shoulder itself, the outline of long fingers marking the top of her arm. My first thought was about the time I was 17 years old and saw a story about a woman who had acid thrown on her face on TV. It looked almost like that, but if a person with inhumanly long hands somehow managed to cover their own hand in acid without injuring themselves and gripped her shoulder as hard as they possibly could. Or maybe like a third-degree burn in the shape of a hand, like if it was from a person who was made of pure fire. She sniffled softly, which pulled me out of my thoughts. In a whispered voice she told me that the doctor said whatever burned her ate away the fat and a good portion of the muscle in that shoulder. She can barely lift that arm now. As the tears ran down her face she talked about how the pain she felt in that moment was like nothing else she'd ever felt before. She couldn't even describe it. She remembered collapsing to the ground screaming bloody murder, and right before she blacked out she said she saw the thing lean over her. And with that horrible smile still on its face it hissed out one word to her. Soon. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Even after the wound healed the pain never stopped and never got better. And that was it, that was the final straw for her. She withdrew from college, packed up her things, and moved states to live with her parents again. And for 1 week things seemed to be okay. She thought maybe it didn't follow her here. Until a bouquet of the same wilted flowers and an empty chocolate box stuffed to the brim with bloody human teeth and fingernails appeared on her parents' doorstep. It got closer after that, more and more cocky, until the night where it actually knocked on her window, banging on the glass with an almost maniacal frenzy until the police arrived. By that point of course, there was nothing there. Not a trace. Since then she's just been driving around the country. Her parents have been sending her money for food and motels. She figured that if it took a week to get from her old town to her parents' house and only seemed to come out at night, then maybe she could keep ahead of it if she just kept moving. After a moment of stunned silence I asked if I could hug her, and rushed over to pull the shaking girl into my arms as soon as I got a nod of approval. I spent the next half hour gently stroking her hair as she sobbed into my shirt. I wanted to help this poor girl so badly, but deep down we both knew there was nothing I could actually do to keep her safe. But I told her the meal was on me and I took her back to my house. It was still light out after all, so I figured it was safe. I let her take a long shower and helped bandage up her arms, made her dinner and introduced her to my cat. And then I cut up some fruit and placed it in Tupperware containers along with some cookies and gave her directions to the nearest motel. I still think about that girl all the time. It's been half a decade and I haven't heard anything about her since. I don't know if she was killed by that thing or if she managed to outrun it, but I still pray every single night that one of these days she'll walk back into my diner and tell me the story of how she defeated that monster over more waffles covered with way too much powdered sugar and a side of fruit. Oh, before I forget, man. I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action. Then he finally answered. "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I'd been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, to put it politely. Feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, well, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late-night drive, and ended up getting turned around on all these 2-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so he and I could both see it before continuing. "So, I was hoping you could point out on here roughly where we are. And, more importantly, the way to get back to the main road?" There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh, softly at first, and then louder. "Dude, a paper map?" he managed out between wheezes. "Are you for real? What year do you think this is, 1993? For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I'd had a bad feeling I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I'd been proven correct. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. "Seriously bro, don't you have GPS in your car or something?" he asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing out the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. "Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me out the door, I could see he wanted to make another quip, probably something about how I should buy a newer car or something. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over the map, and still chuckling softly to himself, began looking at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. "Ha! I still got it," he said proudly, then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. "We're right about here. Roughly 6 or 7 miles outside Placer." I leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. "Here?" He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, then examined the map further. "Okay, so it seems I could take more than a few roads to get back to Interstate 5, right?" The kid nodded again, clearly already bored with the unusual interaction by the slightly annoyed look which had begun to cross his face. "Sure," he said simply, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. "That'll be $14.50 for this, and $28.50 for the gas." I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. "Thanks for the help," I said as I turned to head out the door. "Yeah, no problem," I heard him mutter at me as I crossed to the front door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jangled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around the store, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of the lights over the pumps. The sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to be an elk. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps for my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. "So, did you find out where we are?" asked a voice from the passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. It was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. "Dude, were you in there that long that you forgot I was out here waiting for you?" Not wanting to admit I had done just that, I shook my head. "Nah, bro, not that. Just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache," he nodded sympathetically. "Craig was one of my close friends. Ever since we'd met each other, we'd immediately clicked, and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing we both loved to do was take late-night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This is the first time we've ever gotten lost, though." I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. "Here," I said simply, before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the back seat. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it, the car's buzzer sounding as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline four quietly rumbled to life with its traditional burble. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store. And froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door and staring out at us. What the actual hell? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. "Dude, what the hell is his problem?" I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit, then placed it back in its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. "I don't know, but honestly man, that's more than a bit creepy." I shot one last glance. The kid hadn't even blinked once, he was just staring with an off-putting intensity out the glass. "Come on, let's get out of here," Craig said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch, the car beginning to roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. "Prick," I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way we came. Well, the good thing is, yeah, I did find out where we are. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment, and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. "Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer?" he asked with a slightly astonished tone. "Longer drive than normal, I guess," I answered, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my smoke out. I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45 it read. I let out a small sigh. Great, Vanessa is likely worrying up a storm about us right now. Me, especially. Ever since we'd started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long, late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared I'd get into an accident, either with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time, I'd come home to find her sitting up waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lips slightly. "Hey, you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're okay?" I asked Craig. I heard him let out a snort. "Honestly, bro? No. I know the woman loves you to death, and I'm happy she cares so much, but she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you two need your space. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together." I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. "It's called being in love, dude, you should try it sometime," I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. "Nah, thanks, I enjoy being single too much." Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up on me as I watched the two-lane road stretch out before us, the moon and the sky almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. "Well, what did you expect, Derek? You drove into the boonies, there's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time?" Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled in the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance with the Dead's That House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. "Dude, yes. That's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this." He rolled down the passenger window, sticking his head out the window to whoop and holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat, the tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went, the road stretching out ahead of us and then disappearing into the blackness behind us, the music blasting out from the radio, and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read 5 minutes to 3. We should be at the highway in a minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body, and fumbled into the back seat for the bag, catching it with the tips of my fingers. I pulled my bottle of soda from it and, holding the bottle to the steering wheel, cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road dash. And nearly spit it all out onto the windshield. In the second I'd stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. Fucking hell. I shouted, jamming my feet on the brake and clutch as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up, and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. To my horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. Oh, hell, no. For a few seconds, The world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment we'd smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way we'd come. I could tell from the black lines on the road which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripped the steering wheel with almost a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds, before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. "Dude, what the fuck?" he shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt and practically kicked the door open. Stepping out onto the pavement, I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlight beams. I looked around, first at the road ahead, then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me, over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, it was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No, I know for a fact I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opening made me turn, seeing Craig step out of the car. Leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. "You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the hell just happened before I lose it, bro," he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice, then I answered. Dude, I'm not crazy. Someone stepped out of the woods and onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought I was gonna freakin' hit her. I realized I'd been holding in a breath and let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. "You serious, man?" I nodded. He pulled the flashlight he'd used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree-line on one side of the road, then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. "Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore," his brow furrowed. "But, why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere?" he muttered, more to himself than me. I still answered. "I don't know, man. It's freakin' Josephine County. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos." I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter and reply, but something had caught my attention. A feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there. But the feeling remained, and I didn't like it one bit. Especially when the feeling came again, this time from the direction I'd just been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with the flicker of fear. "Oh, shit," I whispered. Craig turned to look at me. "What?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. He repeated, "What?" I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of a weak voice. "Let's get back in the car, right now." He didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified. As if someone were rapidly approaching from the woods. Oh, hell. I broke, first into a run, then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Craig do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. "What the hell was that, man?" The tone of it gave away the fact he'd felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread and fear I'd had. "You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have someone step into the road and get them to stop?" I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought. And then a bunch of people spring out of the woods trying to ambush them. Oh, hell no. My thoughts exactly. Time to friggin' leave. I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later, we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. "I think we're in the clear, man." Craig let out a soft laugh. "Thank fuck for that," I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let a laugh of my own. "I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this, I may take a bit of a break from late-night drives for a bit. This just got under my skin too much." For a few moments, longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered. "As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand." "No problem at all." I thought I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else I couldn't place, but then I heard him sit up straight. "Hey, Jake?" he asked, a bit of a concerned tone now etched into it. "Yeah?" I heard him draw another breath. Shouldn't we be to the highway by now? Or at least see the lights of passing cars?" I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road in my headlights, but at his words, I jerked my head to look beyond them. What the actual hell? He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the dark. I clearly remembered looking in my side view mirror as we turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glows zipping by both ways at close to the same distance we were now. That wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness. Darkness, and the woods on either side of the road. For a moment, I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirred. He's gotta be mistaken. Hell, I've gotta be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they first look. Feeling somewhat relieved by the thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. And, for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if seeing the woman's step in the road had shaken me more than I'd first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 55 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence. And then, Craig let out a cry. "There! A light!" For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me, and I craned over the steering wheel, looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it was only a streetlight, standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old, worn sign which seemed to have been shot at many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car some as it came towards us so I could read it. And felt a wave of confusion fall over me. Golden, 2 miles. The fuck? Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the streetlight momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on his face. How the hell did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town, one which attracts visitors every year to check out the standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people, but once the prospects dried up in the early to mid-20th century, it became the ghost town it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays was being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer him. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freakin' way, Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas, from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. I honestly don't know, man, I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turn-off for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark hulking shape of the church's spire rising out of the dark for a moment. Then it was behind us. The lighter popped out, and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided I needed to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is, we can't be far now from the highway. So, let's just keep our wits about us, keep calm, and when we get back to my place, you, me and Vanessa can have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath, then let it out in a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh, and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. Glad I've got you, I nodded, then realized he may not be able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m., only 5 minutes had passed since I'd last looked at it. And yet, it felt more like it had been 30. Time seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes, there was only darkness. And then, a light appeared in the distance. Ha! There we go! I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign for the on-ramp appear, and felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by again. That's, wah. Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing he'd seen it as well. As the streetlight and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling I'd had when we'd gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one out there. The turn-off for the ghost town approached again. I heard Craig let out another deep breath. Derek, pull over, please, he said simply. His voice was shaking, and as much as I didn't want to stop, I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turn-off. He ripped his seatbelt off, shoving the door open and stepping out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle, when I glanced at the clock. And froze. The clock was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock washed over me like a wave as I tapped it with my fingers to see if it was merely stuck. But it refused to begin moving again. Okay, what the actual fuck is going on? I whispered to myself. I reached into my pocket, fishing out my phone and turning on the screen. Like the clock, it, too, showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Craig standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type a text out to Vanessa. Hey, baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but have gotten a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you. I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want to worry her any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the front right headlight. Dude, you alright? I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily, he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third calls, I began to feel a new sensation creep up on me. A potent mixture of dread and fear. Craig. Dude, you're creeping me the fuck out. Please say something. He finally turned to look at me, and in the semi-glow of the headlights, I saw his face had gone a bit pale. He raised a finger and pointed, saying only a single word. Look. My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but, with a gasp, I realized it was the same woman who'd nearly caused me to wreck. Oh, fuck me sideways, man. I swallowed, finding my voice. We should get back in the car, Craig, he nodded almost immediately. I think you might be right, he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother pulling my seatbelt on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first and floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us, and the car shot forward onto the road. This time, I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot hard down, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed that I would see something, anything ahead of us. An intersection. A house. A freaking out-of-use payphone, for fuck's sake. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us. The exact same one as before, with the sign underneath. My eyes flickered to the clock, and terror shot through me as I saw it still was frozen at the same time. This isn't good, bro, Craig said from the passenger seat. I agreed with him, but didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turnoff appeared again. And what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road. And she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, I saw others. The outlines of other people. Dozens. Possibly more. They all stood, facing the road. Watching us fly by. And then they disappeared into the rearview mirror. Fuck, I breathed out as the light and sign flashed by yet again. This time, the mass of people had gotten even closer to the road. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. What the hell do we do? Craig asked me, his voice steady, yet filled with fear, the same I felt. I just shook my head. I don't know, man, was all I could say. The streetlight began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to nearly slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Craig look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped. Told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now, I think I'm gonna tell her to call the cops or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look out the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turnoff as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts, demons, whatever they were, had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon as the light began to appear once more. Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment, relief like I'd never felt surged through me at the small bit of normalcy I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me, enough I spoke aloud. The fuck? Craig spoke up. What? What did she say? I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to understand. But it was like I was hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me. But again, the same block was coming to me. As it did, a new wave of fear began to rise up in me. One for an entirely new reason than the terrifying loop flying by outside. The speedometer now showed we were doing 90. And then Craig spoke. Can I ask you a question, man? Ice filled every vein in my body. Not at his question, but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension he'd had not even a minute ago. Now, he just sounded flat. No, not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer, my mouth dry as cotton. What? He answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. Are you scared? For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him, just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated again. My eyes locked with his. The light flew by. The turn-off appeared again, and for a moment, my eyes flicked up to see that the woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face. And then I was screaming, my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right. I saw a tree flying towards the windshield. I didn't think. I just forced the door open and leapt out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in a hospital room, a bandage covering my head and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing I saw was Vanessa, who, upon seeing me wake up, burst into tears and wrapped her arm around me. A few moments later, the doctor came in. He told me that I was a lucky man, apparently. I'd gotten away with only a gash in my head requiring staples, severely bruised ribs, and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. Then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in, and 2 officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what had happened, well, except for 2 small details, anyways. They appeared to take my account seriously, and promised to look into it. We've had some reports similar to yours, sir, one of them answered tentatively. Then they told me how I'd been found. How, a father and son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving, and had come across first my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree and then, lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they'd been. But I had a fair idea who they'd been. At least, the son, anyways. That night was 3 months ago. I've been at home, resting and healing this entire time. It's given me plenty of time to think. Plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night. About any of it. I feel like I'll go insane if I do. Especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck. Only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to, after receiving an email from an unknown address. One claiming to be the son, the kid I saw in the gas station that night. He told me things. Things that his father told him he'd seen for years, that he didn't believe at all. Until that night. When he looked out the door at my car. That's when he'd frantically called his father. As I type this out, I feel myself begin to violently shake. Remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost, as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had. Remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over, and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be, filled with shark-like teeth as black eyes stared hungrily at me, the same, shark-like smile the kid told me he'd been flashed as I'd pulled away. But mostly, I remember the single line of text Vanessa sent me. What caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late-night drives again? The 3 words that will remain burned into my memory forever. Darling, who's Craig?